Aspen Ridge Executive Airfield, Colorado, 1:47 a.m. 9,000 feet above sea level, the cold doesn't wait outside. It comes in through the walls, through the gaps, through the space between a woman and everything she built. The Gulf Stream sits dead on the concrete. $68 million. Silent, she checks her watch. 6 hours. One signature. One city away. The maintenance crew is gone. No explanation. No warning. Just gone. The way things go when someone planned for them to go. And then a truck pulls in. One headlight slightly dimmer than the other. A toolbox with real dents. A man who doesn't introduce himself. He just asks 3 questions. She's never seen him before. He's seen this before. Not the broken plane. The pattern underneath it. He reaches into the aircraft's oldest system, the one nobody thought to erase, and finds something that changes everything. Not about the plane. About the people who needed it grounded. The Aspen Ridge Executive Airfield sat at 9,000 feet above sea level, which meant the cold didn't just sit on your skin. It got inside. It found the spaces between things, between the rivets on a fuselage, between the collar of a coat and the back of a neck, between the seconds on a watch face when you were counting them. Because counting was the only thing left to do. Elizabeth Ashford was counting. 1:47 a.m., 6 hours and 13 minutes until the signature window closed in Seattle. She stood beneath the left wing of a Gulf Stream that cost more than most people's entire neighborhoods, and the Gulf Stream was dead. Not sputtering, not limping, dead. In the way that expensive things die when someone wants them to quietly, completely, and at the exact worst moment imaginable. The hangar lights threw long yellow strips across the concrete floor, and across the belly of the aircraft, and across Elizabeth's Italian leather boots, which were already ruined from standing on oil-stained concrete for 40 minutes, and which she would not think about, because thinking about the boots meant not thinking about the $700 million, currently balanced on a knife's edge, in a conference room in Seattle. Focus. She checked her watch again. Not because the time had changed, because checking it felt like doing something. Kevin Cole appeared at her left elbow, with the expression of a man who had already made 3 phone calls that went nowhere and was deciding how to present that information to a woman who did not respond well to information that went nowhere. He was 28 and sharp, and he had worked for Elizabeth long enough to read her moods through the set of her shoulders rather than the expression on her face, which was useful because her face rarely gave anything away. The regular maintenance crew. He paused, just a fraction. They're not answering. Elizabeth didn't look at him. Not answering, or not there. Both. And that was the thing. That was the specific thing that moved the situation from bad to something else entirely. The regular crew was on retainer precisely for moments like this. Pre-dawn emergencies, last-minute departures. The kinds of situations that cost a company the price of a standing contract rather than the cost of everything else. They were supposed to be reachable. They were supposed to be the answer to the exact problem unfolding on this concrete floor at 1:47 in the morning. Except they weren't answering. Except they apparently weren't there. Elizabeth turned that over in her mind the way you turn something sharp over in your hand carefully, looking for the edge. Because the edge was always somewhere. The airfield manager, a soft-faced man named Dale, whose name tag was slightly crooked and who had been sweating since Elizabeth arrived, despite the temperature being somewhere around 10 degrees Fahrenheit outside the hangar walls, cleared his throat from a respectful distance. There is one other option. Guy named Merritt, Joseph Merritt. He does freelance work, overnight shifts mostly, good with old systems. A pause. I can call him. Elizabeth looked at her watch, looked at the Gulf Stream, looked at the airfield manager. Call him. The truck that pulled into the hangar at 2:03 a.m. was a Ford F-150 that had seen better decades. One of the front headlights was slightly dimmer than the other, which gave the whole vehicle a lopsided, one-eyed quality as it rolled across the concrete. The toolbox in the truck bed had the kind of dents and scratches that came from actual use rather than storage. The man who climbed out moved the way people move when they're tired, but not surprised by being tired like tiredness was just one of the conditions of the night and not worth commenting on. He was 46, tall enough that he had to angle himself slightly coming out of the truck. Shoulders that suggested years of working with his hands rather than years of a gym membership. Hair that had gone salt and pepper somewhere in the last few years. Cut short in the practical way of men who didn't think much about their hair. His face wasn't remarkable in the way that faces in boardrooms were remarkable. It wasn't sharp or polished or engineered to be trusted on first glance. It was the other kind. The kind that took a moment to register and then didn't leave. He didn't introduce himself to Elizabeth. He looked at the aircraft, then at the diagnostic panel display that Kevin had pulled up on a tablet. Then he said 3 things, and only 3 things, without looking at anyone in particular. What are the error codes? Where's the maintenance log from the last inspection? And who signed off on the most recent pre-flight check? Not, hello. Not, I'll do my best. Not, this is a serious situation. Just 3 questions asked in the same tone you'd use to ask someone to pass the salt. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment, top to bottom. The kind of look that made assessments and reached conclusions and filed them away before the subject was even aware of being assessed. She'd been doing it since she was 12 years old, and it had served her well in conference rooms and depositions, and one very memorable shareholder meeting, in which she'd identified the 3 people most likely to vote against her before any of them opened their mouths. The look she gave Joseph Merritt reached a conclusion too. She just wasn't sure yet what the conclusion was, because there was no one else. The hangar was what it was. The night was what it was. And a $68 million aircraft was sitting dead on the concrete doing absolutely nothing for the rescue of a company that needed rescuing in approximately 6 hours. Kevin handed over the tablet. Dale hovered. Elizabeth turned back to her own phone, and the 9 unread messages from the Seattle partners, and the 3 missed calls from people who would want explanations she didn't have yet. Joseph Merritt pulled on a pair of work gloves and started looking at the aircraft like it was a conversation he'd been wanting to have. The night before this one existed in a different world. It was the world of a kitchen in a 2-story house in a quiet part of Glenwood Springs, Colorado, where the mountains were visible from the backyard on clear days, and where the refrigerator had a collection of drawings taped to it from an era when the person who made them was young enough to think refrigerators were galleries. Some of those drawings were still there. Some had been replaced by a school schedule, a dentist appointment reminder, and one photograph tucked in the corner with a magnet shaped like a sunflower. Sandra Merritt was 15 and she was sitting at the kitchen table, with her history notes spread in a radius around her that suggested either very enthusiastic studying or a minor explosion of paper. She had her mother's eyes, Angela's eyes, dark and quick, and paying attention to approximately 5 things at once, and her father's way of sitting, which was the way of someone entirely comfortable taking up exactly the amount of space they needed and not apologizing for it. Joseph was at the stove making pasta, because pasta was the meal that worked at 9:30 at night, when neither of them had eaten properly, and neither of them was going to admit to the other that they hadn't eaten properly. Dad. Sandra didn't look up from her notes. Random question. Okay, if you could have one wish, like an actual wish, what would it be? Joseph stirred the pasta. The question arrived with the particular lightness of a question that was more serious underneath than it appeared on the surface. And he'd lived with Sandra long enough to know the difference. He thought about it for a moment, actually thought about it, which was the only way he knew how to answer a question Sandra asked. I'd wish you went to bed at a reasonable hour. She looked up then, with the expression that was half eye roll and half affection. The expression that Angela used to make when Joseph said something that was technically avoidance, but delivered with enough warmth that you couldn't quite call it out. Dad, that's not a wish. That's a complaint. It's a wish disguised as a complaint. Those aren't the same thing, are they not? She made the sound the short exhale that meant she was pretending to be more exasperated than she was and went back to her notes. Joseph finished the pasta. They ate at the kitchen table with Sandra's history notes pushed to one side and the overhead light warm, and a small specific silence between them. That was the good kind of silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. After Sandra went upstairs, Joseph sat for a while. He didn't turn the kitchen light off. He never turned it off right away. He wasn't sure when he'd started doing that, leaving it on after everyone else had gone to bed, but it had become the way he ended his evenings, sitting with a glass of water at the kitchen table with the light on, and the house quiet around him. The photograph on the refrigerator was Angela. She was standing in front of a rented single-engine Cessna at a private airfield in Wyoming, grinning in the way she grinned when something was about to become a story she'd tell for years. Her hair was doing the thing it did in wind, at high altitude, moving in multiple directions with complete indifference to any plan she might have had for it. They'd rented that plane for their 10th anniversary, flown low and slow over mountain ranges that made the problems of ordinary life look appropriately small, and eaten gas station sandwiches at 3,000 feet because they'd forgotten to pack real food, and Angela had found that so funny she'd nearly spilled her coffee. 3 years since that photograph became the last good one. Joseph didn't look at it every night as something that hurt. He looked at it the way you look at evidence of something that was real to confirm it was real, to make sure the memory had softened itself into something that didn't quite match. The laugh lines around Angela's eyes were real. The wind-destroyed hair was real. The gas station sandwiches were real. He was afraid of the day he looked at the photograph, and the details started to blur. His phone rang at 1:02 a.m. Dale from the airfield, apologetic and specific about the nature of the emergency. Joseph listened, said he'd be there in 40 minutes. He checked Sandra's door on the way out, cracked it an inch, and listened to the quiet and closed it again. Wrote a note in handwriting that Sandra had once described as looking like seismograph data and left it on the kitchen counter. Picked up his toolbox. Drove. The error codes were a problem, not because error codes were unfamiliar. Joseph had been reading them since he was 23 years old, and learning on aircraft that made this Gulfstream look like a museum piece, but because these specific error codes had a pattern to them that made the back of his neck do something. 3 separate systems: auxiliary power, cabin pressure sensors, secondary flight control monitoring, all flagging critical faults simultaneously, all with timestamps that put their failure within a 4-minute window of each other. He stood in front of the diagnostic display for longer than was strictly necessary for just reading numbers. Because here was the thing about mechanical failure, real mechanical failure, the organic kind, the kind that came from wear and age and the accumulated stress of thousands of flight hours. It left a history. It left breadcrumbs. A pressure sensor didn't just decide one Tuesday morning that it was done. It had been getting worse, incrementally. There were patterns in the data going back weeks, sometimes months, small deviations that individually meant nothing and collectively meant the thing was on its way out. These 3 systems had no history like that. They were fine last week. They were fine yesterday. They were critical failures at 11:14 p.m. tonight. Joseph kept his face neutral and his thoughts to himself and asked for the original maintenance records. Not the summary. Not the printout Kevin had prepared with the relevant information highlighted for convenient review. The actual records. Full documentation. Original timestamps and technician signatures going back at least 18 months. Elizabeth Ashford's response was immediate and didn't waver. Those records were confidential company documents. He was an outside contractor who had been in the building for 11 minutes. He understood that, and he put his diagnostic stylus down on the edge of the panel, not loudly but not quietly either, and he said, "If you want me to fix something someone else is trying to hide, you need to let me look in exactly the place that person doesn't want you looking." The hangar held that sentence for a moment. Kevin had the expression of a man trying to decide whether to say something or develop a sudden interest in the ceiling. Dale had retreated to the far wall with a coffee he wasn't drinking. Rebecca Ashby, the company's in-house attorney, who had materialized on a laptop screen that Kevin had propped on a rolling maintenance cart, sharp-eyed, tawny-haired, clearly awake despite the hour in a way that suggested she'd been awake before the call came, looked at the screen with a careful neutrality that wasn't quite neutral. Elizabeth Ashford looked at Joseph. She had a way of looking at people that he suspected she'd developed over years of rooms where looking the wrong way at the wrong moment cost something. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't performance. It was just analytical, precise. The look of someone who had learned to gather information faster than other people gathered air. Whatever she gathered from looking at him, she filed it away without showing him where she filed it. Give him read-only access to the maintenance portal, she said to Kevin. Not to Joseph, to Kevin, the last 18 months. Kevin gave him access. Joseph started reading. Elizabeth's phone rang for the second time at 2:31 a.m. Scott Holt, 8 years. The contact photo was a professional headshot that made him look like the kind of man who had been carefully constructed, rather than simply borne the tie at exactly the right angle. The expression containing the correct blend of confidence and accessibility, nothing accidental about any of it. She answered on the second ring. Habit. His voice had the texture of someone expressing concern that had been arranged and dressed before being spoken. The Seattle partners had been informed of the delay. There were other options for getting this agreement in place. A video call might be sufficient, given the circumstances. He could represent the company. If she felt the situation at the airfield required her direct attention, she could feel every word of it landing on the surface of the truth, and not quite breaking through. I'll be in Seattle, she told him. Elizabeth, if the aircraft isn't safe to, I'll be in Seattle. She ended the call and stood for a moment with the phone in her hand, and the hangar around her doing what hangars do, which is mostly exist at a scale that makes individual human problems feel simultaneously more and less significant than they actually are. Then she walked to where Joseph Merritt was lying half underneath the aircraft's auxiliary control panel, and she said it. She said, fix this plane, whatever you want, name it. No limits. And the hangar was just a hangar for a moment, and the aircraft was just an aircraft, and the clock was just a clock. And Joseph Merritt's voice came from somewhere beneath a panel of wiring that cost more than his truck. My daughter needs a mother. Elizabeth did not move. Kevin did not move. Rebecca on the laptop screen made a small adjustment in her posture that suggested she was considering whether she had just heard what she'd heard. Dale, from the far wall, developed an intense professional interest in the clipboard he was holding. And then there was just the sound of the airfield at 2:31 in the morning, the low mechanical hum of the hangar's climate system, the distant pressure of wind against the building's roof, and the absolute specific quality of a sentence that has been said out loud and cannot be unsaid. Joseph slid back out from under the panel. He stood up. He did not appear flustered. He did not appear to be calculating damage control. He appeared to be someone who had said a true thing and was now simply present in the aftermath of having said a true thing. You asked me what I wanted. Not defensive, not apologetic yet either. Just honest in the specific way of someone who had been caught telling the truth. That's the first honest answer I had. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a proposal. A pause. A short one. It was just what came out before I had the chance to decide whether to say it. He looked at her directly when he said it. Then he turned back to the panel. Elizabeth's expression was the kind that happened when you had a trained response for most things, but had just encountered a category for which no trained response had been prepared. She processed this for approximately 3 seconds, which was, for her, a significant amount of processing time, and then she said, with a precision that was closer to armor than cruelty, I don't have time for this. I know. He was already back at the panel, neither do I. The phone rang at 2:47 a.m. Not Elizabeth's, Joseph's. It was in his jacket pocket, and it buzzed twice before he got to it. Stepping to the edge of the hangar, near the smaller side door that was cracked open to the cold. The temperature outside was a flat and simple 10 degrees, and the air came through the gap like something with opinions, he answered. His voice changed in a way that was not subtle to anyone paying attention, and Elizabeth, standing 20 feet away with her own phone and a string of messages from the Seattle legal team, happened to be paying attention without having decided to pay attention. The voice that answered on the other end was 15, and a little sleepy and a little worried in the way of someone who'd woken up and noticed an absence. Sandra. And Joseph asked her, Did you eat dinner? Did you lock the front door? Do you have your notes ready for your presentation in the morning? 3 questions, no particular order of priority, delivered in a sequence that said something about the architecture of the life he'd built, where meals and locks and school presentations occupied the same tier of importance as one another, because they were all his to track, all his to remember, with no one else keeping the other half of the list. Sandra's voice, even from 20 feet away and filtered through a phone speaker, had a texture that sounded specific, individual, like a person rather than a category. Joseph told her he might be running a little late, kept his voice at the pitch you use when you want someone to hear that everything is fine without having to tell them directly that it is. Said he'd be there before she left for school. Said she should go back to sleep. He ended the call and stood for a moment with his hand still around the phone, and the cold air coming through the gap in the door and the hangar behind him full of expensive problems. Then he went back to the panel. Elizabeth had not moved from where she was standing, but the message she'd been composing on her own phone had not been sent. She looked at it, looked at the aircraft, looked at the back of Joseph Merritt's head as he settled back into the position of a man whose mind was elsewhere only in the way that a compass is elsewhere. It's not absent, it just points somewhere specific, and then comes back. The sentence about his daughter didn't sound the same as it had 5 minutes ago. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She sent the message. It was 3:04 a.m. when Joseph found it. The auxiliary control panel had a component, a small module, integral to the secondary flight monitoring system, the kind of part that technicians noted in logs, and then didn't think about because it wasn't the interesting part. And the serial number on it didn't match the serial number in the maintenance records. The record said this component had been replaced 9 months ago. The wear pattern on the housing said it had been installed in the last few days. The manufacturing date stamped on the reverse, which required a flashlight and a particular angle that wasn't comfortable to maintain, said 3 days ago. He didn't say anything immediately. He double-checked it, triple-checked it, because this was the kind of thing you were certain about, before you said it out loud in a room where the stakes were the size of a company. Then he stood up and he said, "I need to see the original maintenance records, not the portal summary. The actual signed documents. I told you those are, I know what you told me, not rude, specific. There's a component in the auxiliary monitoring system that was installed 3 days ago. The records say 9 months. If that discrepancy is what I think it is, this aircraft is not only grounded by these error codes, it's legally unairworthy, and no one gets on it tonight regardless of what we fix." The temperature in the hangar didn't change, but the air did something. Rebecca on the laptop screen was already typing. Kevin was looking at Elizabeth with the look of someone who needed instruction. Elizabeth looked at Joseph for a longer moment than she had looked at him before. Longer than the analytical look, longer than the assessment look. The kind of look that comes when a person who has spent years being wrong about people in expensive ways is trying to determine whether they're being wrong again. She said, "Rebecca, give him access to the signed documents." Rebecca said, carefully, "That creates a disclosure. I know what it creates." Elizabeth's voice had the quality of someone who had moved past the question and was now living in the answer. "Give him access." Scott called at 3:19 a.m., the third call, and this one was different in texture from the previous two. The previous ones had been concern-shaped. This one had something else underneath it, not quite urgency, not quite warning, something that lived between those two things and didn't have a comfortable name. He told Elizabeth through the speaker, because Kevin had the laptop and the speaker was on, that he'd heard from other board members, that there was growing concern, that the situation was beginning to look like a governance problem rather than a technical one. "And then, I've also heard some background on the contractor you've brought in. Elizabeth, this is a man who was removed from the commercial aviation industry for falsifying a safety report. I understand the situation is urgent, but you're placing the company's most sensitive maintenance data in front of someone with that history." Elizabeth had gone very still. Kevin was looking at the floor. Rebecca's expression on the laptop screen had done something that wasn't quite readable but was definitely something. Joseph was 8 feet away. He'd heard it. The hangar was not a large space, and the speaker was not quiet, and Scott's voice had a carrying quality that suggested it had spent years in rooms larger than this one. Joseph didn't look up from the wiring conduit he was examining. He didn't stop what he was doing. He didn't do anything with his face that Elizabeth could read from where she was standing. She said, to the phone, in a voice that gave nothing away to either side, "I'll call you back." She ended the call, walked the 8 feet, and said without prelude, because she was not a person who reached conclusions slowly, once she'd decided to reach them, "Is that true?" Joseph put down the flashlight, straightened up, looked at her with the expression of someone who had been asked this question, or versions of this question, enough times to know exactly what shape it was. I was removed from the industry. His voice had the quality of something that had been examined many times, and was now simply fact. Not performance, not defense, just the shape of what happened. Not because the report was false, because the report was true, and I gave it to the wrong people at a time when the right people didn't want it to be true. A beat. And the man who had my certification pulled. Another beat, this one with more weight to it, is the man who just called you. The statement arrived in the hangar like weather. Elizabeth's expression did the thing that her expression very rarely did, which was show the precise moment when information reorganized something, not dramatically, just an almost imperceptible shift, the way a door shifts in a frame when the humidity changes, there and then immediately controlled. Kevin looked up from his phone. Rebecca on the laptop screen went very still. Scott Holt's voice was no longer coming through the speaker. The speaker was a rectangular device on a cart, silent, which somehow made it more present rather than less. Joseph, 8 years ago, I was the lead inspection engineer at Meridian Air Group in Texas. Scott Holt was the director of operations. There was a hydraulics issue on one of their charter aircraft secondary system. Not immediately dangerous, but the failure probability curve put it at serious risk within 60 days if it wasn't addressed. I flagged it. I filed the report. I recommended the aircraft be grounded for repairs. He said it in the voice of someone giving testimony. Not emotional, not stripped of emotion, either, just factual, in the way that things that have been carried for 9 years become factual. Scott needed that aircraft flying. There was a contract, $4 million. And if the aircraft was grounded, the contract walked. So he didn't ground it. And when I escalated to the FAA, he produced a version of my report with the risk assessment altered. The numbers were the same. The conclusions were different. My signature was still on it. Elizabeth, the same report. The same document. Different conclusions. My name. You couldn't prove it was altered. I could prove it. It took 3 years and more money than I had. And by the time the decision came through, the outcome had been sitting on my record long enough that no one in commercial aviation would touch me. He picked the flashlight back up, looked at the wiring conduit for a moment that had nothing to do with the wiring. I do freelance work at airfields. I'm good at it. My hours are flexible enough to get Sandra to school in the morning and be home before dark. He looked at Elizabeth then, directly, with no particular expression except the one that comes from having very little left to protect, and therefore no reason to protect it. I didn't plan to tell you any of that tonight, but you asked, Rebecca said, from the laptop screen quietly. Mr. Merritt, when you say he produced an altered version, I know what I'm saying. He wasn't brusque, just certain. I also know where the original record went, and I know what the digital fingerprints on a falsified document look like. And I know that the maintenance log on this aircraft has the same smell to it, different details. Same technique. He looked at the aircraft, which is why I need to see the original signed documents, not the portal version. Because the portal can be edited. The original signatures can't. Rebecca was already on another call. Elizabeth was looking at Joseph, with the expression of someone doing mathematics they hadn't expected to be doing. The hangar hummed. The clock moved. At 3:38 a.m., Rebecca found something in the scheduling system. She had requested access to the crew coordination logs, the internal system that managed dispatch and scheduling for Ashford Aerotech's maintenance teams, and she had found an entry that had no business existing where it existed. The order routing the regular maintenance crew to a different airfield had been entered into the system at 6:47 p. that evening. Elizabeth had confirmed her flight schedule with Scott Holt at 6:52 p.m. Rebecca relayed this without editorial comment, in the careful, measured voice of someone presenting evidence rather than conclusions and allowing the evidence to reach its own conclusions in the minds of the audience. The room was quiet for a moment. 5 minutes. The dispatch order had been placed 5 minutes before Elizabeth told her COO she was flying to Seattle. Kevin said, not quite allowed, but not quite not allowed. That doesn't how does that. It means, Elizabeth said, and her voice had the flatness of someone standing at the edge of something very large, that someone knew about the flight. Before I said anything about the flight, Joseph had not stopped working. but he'd been listening. He listened the way certain people listen completely, without appearing to, without missing anything. He slid back out from under the panel, the third time he'd done that in the last hour, and he looked at Elizabeth and then at the laptop screen, where Rebecca was cross-referencing something. He said, "I need to check the flight data system. The secondary. The one that interfaces with the takeoff sequence." Elizabeth, why? Because if someone was good enough to engineer what I think they engineered, there's a third layer. The component discrepancy was 1. The credential trail was 2. He looked at the aircraft. 3 is the part that makes sure the plane doesn't fly even if you fix everything else. The clock said 3:41. Elizabeth looked at it. Then she looked at Joseph Merritt, standing in a dead aircraft's hangar, at 4- hours to everything, in a jacket that had seen better years, with a daughter who needed a mother and a name that had been methodically destroyed by someone who was currently calling Elizabeth's phone from a comfortable distance and calling it concern. She said, "What do you need?" "Joseph, access to the secondary flight data terminal." And, he glanced around, found the far corner of the hangar where an older equipment rack sat against the wall. That backup terminal, the one that looks like it's from 2009, that equipment is 30 years old. "I know, that's why I need it." He was already moving toward the corner. Elizabeth watched him go, and then she looked at Kevin, and Kevin looked at her, and neither of them said what they were both thinking about a man who had just told them that the person who destroyed his career was the same person currently on their speed dial, because there was no time to think about it, because the clock said 3:42 and Seattle was a flight away, and the aircraft was not yet fixed, and something in the secondary flight data system was waiting to make sure it stayed that way. Elizabeth followed him to the corner. The backup terminal was exactly as described: old, gunmetal gray, the kind of equipment that had been left in corners because no one wanted to move it and no one could justify throwing it away. It had a manufacturer's plate on the side with a date that made Kevin wince visibly. Joseph looked at it the way a person looks at something familiar. Almost fond wasn't the right word, but in the range of fond. "This model uses a separate firmware protocol from the main system," he said it quietly, more to himself than to the room, which means if someone edited the primary records, this one was still running independently. It records what actually happened. A pause. If it's still active, he powered it on. The screen flickered. Ancient technology catching up with a request it hadn't received in what was clearly quite a long time. "Rebecca, from the laptop, Mr. Merritt. Before you access that, I need to flag that any data retrieved outside of the company's primary system may have admissibility questions in a legal context." Joseph looked at the backup terminal's loading screen, then at the laptop. "Ms. Ashby, if I'm right about what's on here, the question of admissibility is the least interesting thing that's going to happen tonight." The screen finished loading. Elizabeth was standing close enough that she could see the reflection of it in her own eyes when she looked at the dark window of the terminal's monitor. And that was the moment. Not the moment when everything was solved. Not the moment when anything was easy. Just the moment, the specific 3:44 a.m. moment, when the night stopped being about a broken aircraft and started being about something else entirely. When Elizabeth Ashford was standing in a cold hangar in Colorado, looking at an old terminal with a man she'd written off the moment his truck pulled in, and the numbers on the terminal screen were beginning to tell a story that no one in this hangar was going to be able to unknow. Scott's voice was still in the room somehow, still carrying. He was removed from the commercial aviation industry for falsifying a safety report. Joseph's voice, quiet, standing next to her as the data loaded. "My name was on the document. I didn't write those conclusions." The data loaded. Elizabeth looked at it, and then she looked at Joseph, who was looking at the screen with the expression of someone who has spent 9 years waiting to be in a room where the right evidence was visible to the right people, and who was still, somehow, not performing anything about it. Not relief, not vindication. Just present, just in the room. Just reading the data the way he read everything, like the truth was in the numbers, if you looked at the numbers honestly. She was going to have to make a decision very soon about who she believed, and the clock said 3:46 and Seattle was waiting. and the aircraft was still on the ground, and the backup terminal's ancient screen was full of timestamps and access logs, and the beginning of a story that was going to change the shape of everything before the sun came up over the Colorado mountains. She had about 30 seconds before that decision made itself. The backup terminal had a fan that made a sound like a very small and very determined insect. It had been making that sound for approximately 4 minutes now, which was how long the screen had been loading, which was how long Elizabeth had been standing in the corner of a hangar at 3:46 in the morning, watching a piece of equipment that predated her company's current legal department decide whether it wanted to cooperate tonight. Joseph waited. Not the way people wait when they're pretending to be calm. The way people wait when waiting is simply what the moment requires, and performing impatience wouldn't change the timestamp on anything. Elizabeth waited differently. She had the quality of someone whose entire nervous system was running at a frequency just above what the human eye could detect still on the outside, everything moving very fast on the inside. Her watch said 3:47. Seattle said 8:00 a.m. The math between those two numbers was not comfortable math. The terminal finished loading. The screen filled with data in a font that belonged to a different era of aviation, blocky, utilitarian, designed for readability under bad conditions rather than for the aesthetic preferences of a particular decade. Log entries, timestamps, access records. The raw architecture of what the aircraft's secondary system had witnessed and quietly written down in its own independent language, while the primary system was being told a different story. Joseph leaned forward, not dramatically, just closer to the screen, in the way of someone reading something that requires proximity because it deserves proximity. Elizabeth leaned forward too, without deciding to. The first timestamp on the screen said 6:39 p.m. She looked at it, looked at Joseph, back at the screen, because 6:39 p.m. was 13 minutes before she had confirmed her flight schedule with Scott Holt at 6:52 p.m., and the entry at 6:39 p.m. was not a maintenance note, not a routine system check. It was a command string, embedded in the secondary flight data protocol, compact and precise and written in the specific language of someone who understood the system well enough to instruct it to lie to anyone who asked the primary system what the truth was. So, not a response to her announcement, not a reaction, preparation. Someone had set this in motion before she opened her mouth. Joseph, there it is. Elizabeth, what exactly am I looking at? A lockout command nested in the secondary system. He traced the screen with one finger, not touching it, just indicating. This is why the aircraft can't fly. Not because anything is mechanically wrong, because this command tells the takeoff sequence to abort. No matter what the instruments say, no matter how many parts you replace. He looked at her. The plane was never broken. It was locked. And that was the distinction. That was the specific terrible distinction between a thing that had failed and a thing that had been made to appear failed. One was an accident. One was a decision. One was an act of God or engineering entropy or bad luck. The other was an act of a specific person at a specific time for a specific reason. And the reason was sitting in Elizabeth's contacts list under the name Scott Holt, C.O. Rebecca. From the laptop screen across the hangar, had been on a separate call. She ended it, looked at the room, the camera logs for the executive floor hallway. I requested them from building security 20 minutes ago. They just came through, Elizabeth. Anne, Rebecca pulled something up on her own screen. Her expression did the thing that trained legal professionals' expressions do when they find what they were looking for, and are in the process of deciding how to present it without appearing to be anything other than neutral. The badge reader outside Scott's private office logged entry at 6:31 p.m. The biometric scanner confirmed identity, not a borrowed badge, not a cloned credential, a pause. Him, Scott Holt, in his own office, at 6:31 p.m., 11 minutes before Elizabeth told him about the flight. Kevin made a sound that was not quite a word. Elizabeth was very still. Joseph was reading the rest of the terminal data. He scrolled slowly, methodically, the way a person reads when they are looking for a specific thing, and have enough discipline not to skim past it. The fan in the terminal continued its small determined sound. Outside, the wind had picked up against the hangar roof. and the building said something low and structural about that. Then Joseph stopped scrolling, and the quality of his stillness changed. Not alarmed. Something more specific than alarmed. The stillness of someone who has just found the thing that turns a bad situation into a different category of situation entirely. Elizabeth, what? He didn't answer immediately. He read it twice. Because this was the kind of thing you read twice before you said it in a room with lawyers and company executives, and a recording device that Rebecca had quietly turned on approximately 8 minutes ago. There's a file. Buried in the archive. Draft status. He looked at Elizabeth. It's a transfer agreement. The room held that word. Transfer agreement. 41% of Ashford Aerotech's operating shares. Joseph's voice was even. Deliberately even. The evenness of someone who understood that the information he was delivering had a certain mass to it, and that mass deserved to be handled carefully. To an entity called Crane Capital Group. At a price that's, he checked the document, 58% below current market valuation. Kevin, that's not a sale. That's a. It becomes effective, Joseph continued, upon the chief operating officer assuming negotiating authority under the company's emergency governance clause. The silence that followed was a specific Colorado at 4 a.m. kind of silence, the kind that sits in large spaces, the kind that has no interest in being filled quickly. Elizabeth looked at the screen, at the transfer agreement that had been drafted and buried and set to activate the moment she missed her deadline, and Scott Holt became, legally, the person with authority to sign things on behalf of the company her father had built from a single-engine repair operation in Denver into the enterprise currently represented by a $68 million aircraft that someone had deliberately locked to the ground. Jacob Crane. Crane Capital Group. She knew the name. The industry knew the name. Jacob Crane was the kind of investor who appeared during moments of institutional vulnerability not to rescue companies but to acquire them at the price that distress made possible, then restructure them into something leaner and less like what they'd been, and more like what was profitable for Jacob Crane. And he had a signed draft agreement waiting in a buried file on a 9-year-old backup terminal in a hangar in Colorado. Elizabeth, how long has that document been in the system? Joseph, draft was created 14 days ago. 14 days. 2 weeks. While Scott Holt was in the office every morning. While he was attending the board meetings. While he was calling to express concern about flight safety at 3 a.m. Rebecca was typing. Fast. The kind of typing that sounded like purpose. The board call came in at 3:58 a.m. Scott had convened it. Emergency session presented to the members as a necessary response to a developing situation that required collective oversight. The 7-person board materialized on the large screen that Kevin had wheeled to the center of the hangar faces in various states of domestic displacement. One member clearly calling from what appeared to be a home office that smelled of pipe tobacco and considered opinions. Another with a bedroom lamp visible behind her that cast long shadows across what was probably a very comfortable distance from all of this. And Scott was there, centered on the screen. Composed in the way of someone who had been preparing for this particular conversation for 14 days. Jacob Crane was there too. Nobody had invited Jacob Crane, but there he was, positioned just to Scott's left, in a room that was clearly not his office at this hour, wearing a jacket that cost more than Kevin's monthly salary, and an expression that suggested he found everyone else's urgency slightly inconvenient. Elizabeth stood in front of the screen, in her ruined coat, with the faint suggestion of hydraulic fluid on her left sleeve that she hadn't noticed yet, with Joseph Merritt visible in the background, still at the backup terminal, not looking at the camera. Scott's opening, measured, concerned, impeccably timed. There was, he explained to the board, growing concern about the decision-making framework in play tonight. A CEO under extreme pressure. An outside contractor with a documented history of professional misconduct. Company data being accessed outside proper authorization channels. He said all of this in the voice of a man who genuinely regretted the necessity of saying it. Jacob Crane said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence said everything his silence was designed to say. I am here because the outcome of this meeting matters to me, and things that matter to Jacob Crane tend to go a certain direction. One of the board members, the one with the pipe tobacco office, raised the emergency clause, calmly, clinically, as if reading from a document, which he probably was. If the chief executive failed to fulfill the conditions of the existing partnership agreement within the specified window. If negotiating authority transferred by default. If the COO of all was positioned to execute agreements on the company's behalf. Then. The logic of the clause was airtight. It had been written airtight by a lawyer who had not anticipated being used as a mechanism for the thing it was currently being used for. Scott. Sympathetic, understanding. No one wanted this outcome, but given the circumstances, Elizabeth. Show them. Kevin looked at her. She looked at Kevin. The terminal. Show them what's on the terminal. Kevin hesitated for a fraction of a second. That was not about capability, and entirely about the size of what she was asking. Then he repositioned the camera on the laptop, angled it toward the backup terminal's screen, and Joseph moved slightly to one side without being asked because he understood what was needed without needing it explained. The board saw the terminal, the timestamp, the lockout command, the access logs with Scott's credential and badge confirmation at 6:31 p.m. And then Kevin scrolled to the draft transfer agreement. The board saw that too. Scott's composure did not break. That was the thing about a certain kind of person. Their composure didn't break under pressure because it was never quite real in the first place. It was architecture rather than emotion, and architecture bends before it breaks. This is, he said, with a patience that was its own kind of aggression, unverified data from an unauthorized source, retrieved by a contractor with documented reasons to want to discredit my name. Retrieved using methods that may not withstand legal scrutiny. He looked at Elizabeth through the screen with something that was almost kind. I understand you're under pressure. But this is not a reliable basis for. The timestamp is 6:39 p.m. Elizabeth's voice had shed everything that wasn't essential. I told you about the flight at 6:52 p.m. That's on record. I have the message thread. She looked at the board. Not at Scott, at the board. Someone locked this aircraft 13 minutes before I said anything about flying it. The credential that locked it belongs to one office. That office's biometric scanner confirmed who was there. Pipe Tobacco board member. Carefully, Miss Ashford. You understand how this looks from. I understand how it looks. She did not break eye contact with the camera. I also understand what it is. And I'd like you to tell me which of those two things you want to make decisions based on. Jacob Crane leaned forward slightly. The board's responsibility is to the company's stability, not to Mr. Crane. Rebecca's voice came from the laptop, sharp and clean as a line drawn with a ruler. You are not a member of this board. You are present at this meeting without authorization. Any statement you make in this context may be considered evidence of coordination with the individual currently under internal review. A pause. The kind that lawyers deploy as punctuation. I'd recommend you consider that before your next sentence. Jacob Crane said nothing, which was in its way its own kind of statement. Scott shifted tactics at 4:11 a.m. The composure had been recalibrated. What replaced the concern-shaped performance was something with sharper edges, still controlled, still fluent, but no longer bothering with the texture of sympathy. He turned to the board and he said that they were being asked, at 4 a.m, to accept the testimony of a man whose professional record contained a single defining event, a falsified safety report filed under his own name at Meridian Air Group in Texas, 9 years ago. A man who had, since that event, been working contract jobs at regional airfields. A man who had, by his own account, extensive personal history with Scott Holt that provided substantial motivation for exactly this kind of accusation. He said it well. He said it in the order that made it most effective. Building from credential to motive to implication. Never quite arriving at the word lying but landing close enough that the word was present in the room without being attributable to him. 2 of the 7 board members were visibly uncertain. Elizabeth could see it, the micro-expressions of people recalculating. Not committed to Scott's position, not committed to hers, hovering in the uncomfortable space of a 4 a.m. emergency where the cost of being wrong was significant in either direction. Joseph had been silent through all of this. He'd stepped back from the terminal when the camera reoriented. He was standing near the edge of the hangar's main floor. In the place where the lighting was slightly dimmer, with his arms at his sides and his face, showing nothing that could be read as defensiveness or appeal, or the kind of performed dignity that people perform when they want to appear not to be performing dignity. He was just standing there, in the way he'd been standing and working all night, like a man who understood that the truth of a thing didn't depend on how urgently you advocated for it. And Elizabeth, watching him from across the hangar while Scott's voice filled the screen behind her, understood something she hadn't been positioned to understand 3 hours ago. The man in the faded jacket who had asked for 3 things and then gotten to work, who had answered her offer with the only honest thing in his head, who had answered her questions about his history, without asking for her sympathy or her belief or anything at all beyond the opportunity to keep working, who talked to his 15-year-old daughter at 2:47 a.m. in the voice that had nothing to do with performance, because Sandra was the one person in his life who didn't require performance. People who wanted to deceive you told you to trust them. They spent energy on the concept of your trust. They managed it. They cultivated it. They called you at 3 in the morning in the voice of concern, and they positioned themselves near power brokers, and they made sure they were in the room for the vote. Joseph Merritt had not asked her to trust him once. He had asked to look in the right place. He had done the work. He had told her what he found. Those were different things. Entirely different things. Rebecca. Elizabeth's voice cut through Scott's mid-sentence. Plug in the chip. The hangar went quiet. Scott, Elizabeth, this is exactly the kind of reactive, Rebecca. Same volume, same direction. Not louder, not harder. Just the voice of someone who has made the decision and is now living in the action rather than the deliberation. Rebecca, from the laptop screen, had the expression of someone who had been hoping she'd say that, already on it. The chip was a secondary memory module, the size of a thumbnail, extracted from the backup terminal's auxiliary slot, where Joseph had found it during his initial examination of the aircraft's external data ports. It contained, in the compressed notation of its firmware protocol, a separate layer of log data, not the operational logs visible on the main screen, but the system-level record of every command, every access, every instruction the secondary flight management network had processed in the last 30 days. The kind of record that existed specifically because aviation regulators had, decades ago, understood that primary systems could be altered, and had required a secondary record that was harder to reach, and therefore harder to change. Rebecca connected it to her laptop via an adapter that Kevin found in the maintenance equipment room after 90 seconds of increasingly focused searching. The data loaded faster than the terminal had. New equipment, cleaner connection. 3 things came out of it. The first was the lockout command with the 6:39 p.m. timestamp, now with additional metadata, the specific user session ID, the network node it had been executed from, and a digital fingerprint that Rebecca would later confirm, matched the administrative workstation, registered to Scott Holt's private office on the executive floor. The second was a complete access log, the maintenance portal, showing that 12 days ago, at 11:23 p.m., someone had accessed the maintenance records for the Gulfstream from Scott's workstation and modified 4 entries. The original values were preserved in the secondary log. The modified values were what Joseph had been looking at in the portal. The discrepancy between them was, in Rebecca's subsequent assessment, exactly the kind of discrepancy that made an aircraft appear legally airworthy when the paperwork was examined quickly, and legally unairworthy when it was examined carefully. The third thing was the transfer agreement, not the draft version from the buried archive. A second version, dated 3 days later, with one addition. A signature block, pre-populated, waiting for Scott Holt's execution upon assumption of emergency negotiating authority, and beneath Scott Holt's signature block, another name, Jacob Crane, who was, at this moment, visible on the board call screen, positioned slightly to the left of a man who had been engineering this specific outcome for at least 2 weeks, in a room that was clearly not his usual late-night location, wearing the expression of a person who had believed until approximately 90 seconds ago that things were going to go a certain way. The board member with the pipe tobacco office said, with the careful inflection of someone choosing their words with both hands, "Mr. Crane, can you explain your relationship to this document?" Jacob Crane looked at the document on the screen, looked at the board, looked at Elizabeth, did the calculation, and said nothing, which was not the same as not answering, which was in the context of a board call at 4:22 a.m., with evidence on the screen and a company attorney already uploading the data to the legal department's secure archive. Its own kind of answer. Scott made one more attempt. The voice was still controlled, but the architecture was showing stress fractures. This data was retrieved outside of authorized Rebecca. The repair authorization signed by Ms. Ashford at 2:08 this morning grants the contracted technician access to all aircraft systems and associated data necessary to diagnose and repair the reported faults. That authorization is on file and time-stamped. She looked at the camera with the expression of someone who had been waiting to say this specific sentence for approximately an hour. Mr. Merritt was hired to fix a plane. It turns out the most broken thing in this building tonight wasn't the aircraft. The board suspended Scott's system access at 4:31 a.m., not terminated, not yet, suspended, pending a full internal investigation, which Rebecca had already drafted the framework for on a separate document that she would later describe as something she'd started drafting. When Joseph found the component serial number discrepancy, because being prepared was different from being presumptuous, and a good attorney understood the difference. Jacob Crane disconnected from the board call without a farewell, which was its own form of statement and not a subtle one. 5 of the 7 board members voted to continue the original partnership agreement proceedings. The remaining 2 abstained pending further review of the evidence, not disagreement, just the particular caution of people who needed 24 hours and a cup of actual coffee before they committed to anything with legal consequences, which was, Elizabeth would later note, a completely reasonable position at 4:31 in the morning. The immediate crisis was documented, contained, and forwarded to legal counsel. The aircraft was still on the ground. So, 2 problems down, 1 still standing on the concrete. Joseph was at the aircraft again. He'd gone back to it during the board call's final 15 minutes with the focused ease of someone who understood that the drama in the room didn't change the technical requirements of the task. The lockout command needed to be properly cleared. The mismatched component needed to be correctly replaced. A pressure test needed to confirm that everything was actually what it said it was before anyone put altitude between themselves and the ground. The backup maintenance crew had arrived sometime during the board call. A team from a regional facility 40 miles south, summoned by Dale, who had, at some point between 2:00 and 4:00 a.m., decided that the most useful thing he could do was make calls and stay out of the way. The crew was capable, experienced. They moved through the aircraft with the competence of people who knew what they were doing. But they'd arrived at a system that had been deliberately tampered with, and they had the specific hesitation of technicians encountering evidence that someone smarter than them had been in here first, doing things that left traces that didn't quite look like anything they'd trained for. Joseph walked them through it, not impatiently, not condescendingly, with the particular clarity of someone who had spent 20 years explaining technical problems to people who needed to understand them in order to fix them rather than simply being told what to fix. He showed them what the lockout command had done, and where it nested, and how to clear it without triggering the backup protocol that would re-engage it. He showed them the component and the serial number discrepancy, and what a correctly matched replacement looked like. The crew worked. Joseph moved alongside them, not directing as much as accompanying close enough to catch a mistake before it became a problem, far enough back to not suggest he didn't trust them. Elizabeth found herself standing near the aircraft again, not to supervise, just near it. Because the aircraft was where the work was happening and she had run out of phone calls to make and decisions to hold off on, and the energy that had been sustaining her since 1:47 a.m. needed somewhere to go. Joseph handed her something without looking at her first. A flashlight, the one he'd been using. The secondary pressure valve is behind panel C7. Kevin can hold the light, but his hands aren't steady enough for the angle. Elizabeth looked at the flashlight. She was the CEO of a private aviation company. She had a standing appointment with a personal trainer. She had a closet in her Denver apartment that contained clothes worth more than the airfield's annual liability insurance. She had, on 3 separate occasions, been named to lists of women in business that were compiled by publications with large readerships. She took the flashlight. She got on the floor. The concrete was cold through the fabric of her coat, the coat which had cost what it had cost, and would have to be cleaned in a way that would require a specific conversation with the dry cleaner made contact with the hangar floor. And Elizabeth did not think about the coat, because the coat was not the point. The pressure valve behind panel C7 was in a position that required the flashlight to be held at an angle that was not comfortable for a human arm, and Elizabeth held it at that angle, and Joseph worked, and the only communication between them, for a period of about 12 minutes, was the occasional adjustment left 2 inches and the sounds of work. At 4:53 a.m., Kevin brought her coffee from a machine somewhere in the airfield's administrative building. It tasted like it had been in the machine since the previous administration. She drank it. Joseph was on his feet, checking the indicator panel with one of the maintenance crew. Something in his posture had changed, not relief, but the particular quality of a body that has been working at a sustained pitch and has received information that the pitch can drop a few degrees. Elizabeth, talk to me. Joseph, mechanical systems check clean. Components replaced with a verified match. The lockout is cleared. He looked at the panel one more time. We need the pressure test to confirm cabin integrity. 20 minutes. We have the time. She checked her watch. 4:54 a.m. barely, a beat, she said without quite planning to say it, because it was 4:54 a.m. and planning things was a resource she'd nearly exhausted. He was in your maintenance reports too, wasn't he? The original falsified document, the one from Texas, not a question, a thing that had become clear while she was lying on the concrete floor, holding a flashlight and thinking about the specific technique of a man who altered conclusions without changing numbers. Joseph turned from the panel. The method was the same. Different aircraft, different dollar amount, same technique. Something moved in his face, not bitterness, which was what you'd expect, but the more complicated thing that exists on the other side of bitterness. The place you arrive after you've been through it and found your way out. I've thought about it a lot. Why the same method twice? I think people do what worked before. They count on the fact that no one's looking at the right system. He glanced at the backup terminal in the corner. They didn't count on the backup. He didn't know it still had independent firmware. Most people don't know aircraft that old had independent firmware, because most people aren't interested in aircraft that old. He almost smiled. I kept my certification current in the systems of every aircraft I'd ever worked on, because I knew someday someone was going to ask me to explain something, and I wanted to be able to explain it. Someday someone was going to ask. 9 years of freelance contracts and overnight shifts and school pickup and kitchen table solitude and the maintained certifications and the renewed licenses and the knowledge carefully kept current for a someday that had materialized in a hangar at 10 degrees Fahrenheit at 5 in the morning. Elizabeth thought about her father, Gerald Ashford, who had said not once but many times, in the way that people say things many times when they believe them deeply enough, that the moment you stopped preparing for the opportunity was the moment the opportunity arrived. She'd found it sentimental when she was young. She'd found it accurate as she got older. She found it, right now, at 4:56 a.m., unexpectedly moving in a way she had no framework for at this particular moment of her life. She didn't say any of that. She said, the pilot situation. Yeah. Joseph had been aware of the pilot situation for approximately 40 minutes. Your lead pilot won't fly while the investigation is active, which is his right, and it's the correct call. I know it's the correct call. She looked at the aircraft, which leaves me with a plane that's about to be airworthy and no one qualified to fly it. Not no one. She looked at him. And here was the thing about the way Joseph Merritt said things. He didn't build to them. He didn't construct a rhetorical approach. He said them when they needed to be said, and then waited to see what happened. With the composure of a man who had learned that composure cost less in the long run than the alternative. My commercial license is current. My test flight certification is current. I have logged hours on this exact aircraft model. He met her look with the same directness she'd been receiving from him all night. I haven't been in a cockpit since my wife died, but the certifications are valid. I renewed them. He let that land. Because they were the only thing that got renewed without a fight. The maintenance crew was running the pressure test. The indicators were cycling. The hangar was doing the particular thing hangars do when work is nearing completion. The sounds shifting from active to confirmatory, from doing to checking, the quality of attention in the room changing. Elizabeth, you'd fly. Joseph, under specific conditions. Co-pilot with current certification. Full pre-flight documentation. We don't cut anything short because the clock is uncomfortable. That's going to take 17 minutes for pre-flight if we start now. We land in Seattle with time. She looked at the clock. The clock looked back. What conditions, she said, would you not fly under? He thought about that. Genuinely thought about it, the specific honest consideration of a person who doesn't give an answer until they have the answer. If the pressure test comes back with anything that doesn't match, we don't fly. Non-negotiable. No amount of time pressure changes that. And if it comes back clean, then we go. The pressure test took 19 minutes, not 17, because the world does not operate on the schedule of convenience. But every indicator came back at the values it was supposed to come back at, confirmed twice, cross-referenced against the maintenance record of the replacement component, signed off by 2 members of the crew and by Joseph, whose signature on an aviation document had been absent from official records for 9 years and was now at 5:09 a.m. in a Colorado hangar, present again. Elizabeth looked at his signature on the form. She didn't say anything about it, but she didn't look away from it quickly either. Kevin received a notification at 5:11 a.m. that initially presented itself as a routine message from the facilities management system, and turned out to be anything but. He brought it to Elizabeth with the expression of someone carrying something slightly heavier than expected. The dispatch order for the regular maintenance crew, the one that had sent them to the other airfield before the flight was even announced, had been traced to a phone number. Not the internal dispatch line. A personal cell. And the number, when Kevin ran it through the company's contact directory at Rebecca's request, returned a name. Not Scott Holt, the head of the technical maintenance division. Ronald Garrett, who was currently at St. Anthony Hospital in Denver, following emergency abdominal surgery that had begun at 8:00 p.m. the previous evening. Kevin said, carefully, the dispatch order went out at 6:47 p.m. Elizabeth, he was in surgery at 8:00, yes. So at 6:47, he was still at the hospital. Pre-op, Kevin looked at his phone. He had his personal phone with him until approximately 7:30 p.m. based on his last outgoing text, which meant Ronald Garrett had sent the dispatch order from a hospital bed, approximately 45 minutes before going under general anesthesia, on the evening of a day when the CEO of his company had not yet told anyone she was planning to fly. Elizabeth stood with that for a moment. Not one person. 2 people who knew. 2 people who had received information that wasn't available through any channel she could identify, and had acted on it, before she opened her mouth, which meant the leak wasn't an assumption or an inference. It was a source. Someone inside her immediate circle who had known her schedule before she announced it and had communicated it to at least 2 other people. She looked at Kevin. Kevin had the expression of a man who had just had the same realization and was not yet sure how to present it. Joseph was in the cockpit by then, running pre-flight checks with the co-pilot Rebecca, had sourced through a certified independent aviation contractor who had been reached at 4:40 a.m. and had arrived, impressively, at 5:05. In the manner of professionals who understand that unusual hours are part of the job's definition. Elizabeth went to the boarding stairs, stopped at the base of them, looked up at the aircraft, $68 million, named Ashford II, which her father had named, because the first aircraft had been a leased Cessna that barely made it out of Colorado, and he'd said if he ever had a second one he'd name it something that sounded like it had arrived somewhere. Gerald Ashford had flown in this aircraft 4 times before he died. He'd sat in the 3rd seat on the left, and eaten gas station almonds and read engineering specifications for the kind of aircraft he would never be able to afford, and never stopped believing he'd eventually figure out. The aircraft that was supposed to stay on the ground tonight. The aircraft that was supposed to sit in this hangar as evidence of a CEO who had failed at the critical moment and required per the carefully constructed legal mechanism in the company's emergency governance clause replacement. The aircraft that was going to Seattle. Elizabeth climbed the stairs. At 5:16 a.m., Sandra called. Joseph was in the cockpit 3 minutes into the pre-flight checklist when his phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He looked at the screen, looked at the co-pilot, who was running his own instrument checks with the professional focus of someone who had done this often enough that he could do it with peripheral awareness rather than total attention. Joseph answered. Sandra's voice was the voice of someone who has woken from sleep and registered an absence and is trying to figure out how alarmed to be about it. She was calibrated to the rhythms of their household, the way people calibrated valves to the rhythms calibrated themselves to the rhythms of things that mattered. She knew when the truck should be in the driveway and when it wasn't. She was 15 and she was smart, and she tried, in the way of a particular kind of teenager who had grown up alongside loss, not to let her father see that she worried, but she was also 15. And it was 5:16 in the morning. Joseph's voice when he answered her was not the voice he'd been using in the hangar for the last 3 hours. It was the other one, the frequency that existed only for her, lower, slower, carrying no urgency because the urgency of the night was not a thing Sandra needed to carry. She asked if he was coming home. He told her he'd be a little later than expected, asked about the presentation, asked about breakfast, asked if she'd locked the back door. Because the back door had a tendency to not quite catch and he'd been meaning to fix the latch for 2 months and hadn't yet because fixing the latch kept getting displaced by other things on the list. She said she'd locked it, said the presentation was ready, said, "Are you okay?" And Joseph said, "I am. Not the automatic okay, the actual one. I've been dealing with something tonight, but it's working out." She said, "Okay. Don't forget your coffee." "I already forgot my coffee." A small sound from her, the half-asleep version of the sound she made when he said something that she found approximately 30% funnier than she was going to let on. Then, "Dad, whatever's happening, you're going to handle it right." He looked out the cockpit window at the hangar floor, at Elizabeth Ashford, who was making her way to her seat in the cabin below, still in the coat with the hydraulic fluid on the sleeve, at the hangar doors, which Kevin and Dale were pulling open to reveal the tarmac, the runway, and the Colorado sky at 5:17 in the morning, which was the color of something between night and day, that didn't have a common name but was particular and specific and looked, if you paid attention, like something that was deciding what it was going to be. "I think so," Joseph said, which was not the same as yes, and was not the same as probably, but was the honest answer, which was the only kind he knew how to give her. Good. She was already drifting back towards sleep. "Come home," he ended the call. The co-pilot looked at him. Joseph looked at the instruments, then at the runway, then at the clock which said 5:19 a.m., and at the sky which said decide. "Pre-flight checklist complete?" Joseph asked. The co-pilot complete. "Tower clearance?" "Cleared to taxi." Joseph put his hands on the controls for the first time in 3 years, 8 months, and a number of days he'd stopped counting, because the counting was its own kind of trap. The Gulf Stream began to move. Out of the hangar and across the tarmac and toward the runway of the Aspen Ridge Executive Airfield, in the last full dark before the Colorado morning decided what it was going to be. He didn't think about Angela right then, or rather he didn't try not to think about her, which was the trap. He just let her be where she was, which was everywhere and nowhere, and in a photograph on a refrigerator in a house where a 15-year-old was drifting back to sleep, and he flew. The aircraft left the ground at 5:23 a.m. The lights of Glenwood Springs were small and specific below and to the east. And then the Rockies opened up beneath the aircraft, in the particular geometry of mountains at altitude ridgelines and snowfields, and the long dark valleys between them, and none of it looked like a problem from up here. It looked like what it was. Colorado in the last few minutes before dawn. The sky between Colorado and Washington State was the color of something that hadn't decided yet. Not black, not blue, the specific gray-purple of 5:40 in the morning. At 38,000 feet, where the atmosphere was thin enough that the stars were still present, but losing their argument with the approaching day. Elizabeth was not asleep. She had tried. For approximately 11 minutes, she had attempted the exercise of closing her eyes and letting the white noise of the aircraft at cruising altitude do what white noise was supposed to do. What it did instead was give her an undistracted environment in which to review every decision she'd made in the last 4 hours, which was not the same as rest. She gave up at 5:47 a.m. and looked out the window at the geography of the American West arranged below her in the dark, the high plateau of eastern Oregon, the long grid of agricultural land, the occasional cluster of lights that meant a town where people were either still asleep or already awake, and neither category knew anything about a woman on a plane with hydraulic fluid on her sleeve and approximately 6 weeks' worth of corporate crisis, compressed into a single night. Rebecca was working. She had been working since the moment the aircraft left the ground. Her laptop screen cast a clean white rectangle in the dim cabin, and her fingers moved across the keyboard with the particular consistency of someone who had a list and was getting through it not frantically, not slowly, at the pace of competence. She had already uploaded the complete chip data to the company's legal archive with timestamp that would withstand any subsequent challenge. She had already drafted the formal complaint to the FAA regarding the maintenance record falsification. She had already begun the preliminary brief for the internal investigation, which would need to move quickly, because the board was going to want a timeline before the business day in Denver started, and board members began receiving calls from journalists. Because these things leaked. They always leaked. Not necessarily by design, sometimes just by the law of large systems, which was that information moved toward the surface the way water moved toward the drain, following the path of least structural resistance until it found an opening. Rebecca to her screen, to no one in particular, and therefore to Elizabeth. Ronald Garrett's attorney contacted the company's legal line at 5:31 a.m. He's prepared to cooperate fully with the investigation. His client apparently has been in a difficult position with Mr. Holt for approximately 8 months. Financial leverage, a loan that was called in with irregular terms. She paused typing. He didn't want to be involved, but he was involved, and now the involvement is on record. Elizabeth, what kind of loan? Personal, not company-related. Which makes it cleaner for the investigation and considerably worse for Scott, because it demonstrates a pattern of using personal leverage for professional manipulation. Rebecca returned to typing. It's the kind of thing that makes federal prosecutors interested. Federal, not just civil. Elizabeth turned that word over. Federal. Scott Holt, who had arrived at Ashford Aerotech 8 years ago, with a resume that had been verified and references that had been checked, and a handshake that had suggested a man whose reliability was structural rather than situational. Scott Holt, who had attended her father's memorial and said something genuinely kind about Gerald Ashford's work ethic that Elizabeth had believed was genuine because it had sounded genuine. Scott Holt, who had been engineering a transfer agreement in the background of every meeting they'd had for the past 2 weeks, at minimum. The word federal kept its specific weight. Kevin, who had been quiet in the seat across the aisle, with his laptop and his coffee, and the expression of a man who had witnessed considerably more than his job description had prepared him for, looked up. The Seattle partner's office contacted me. They've been briefed by their own legal team on the board call. Ronald Ray's assistant, a pause. Small. He wants to know if you're still coming. Elizabeth, tell him I'm 40 minutes out. He also wants to know, what? If you're okay. Kevin said it the way young people said things they felt were potentially inappropriate to their employer quickly, so the exposure time was minimized. Those were his words, he said to ask specifically. Ronald Ray, 61 years old. 3 decades in Pacific Northwest aviation investment. A man Elizabeth had met 4 times in professional contexts and twice in social ones, and who had, on every occasion, given her the impression of someone who gathered information about people through methods that didn't involve asking them direct questions. Apparently, he'd changed his method. Tell him I'll answer that in person. She looked at the window. Tell him we're on schedule, Kevin typed. Sent. Looked at his screen, read the response. He says, and I'm quoting directly, that's the right answer. Elizabeth did not smile, but something in her face did a thing that was adjacent to it. The cockpit door was ajar. Not open. The operational protocols of a moving aircraft at cruising altitude maintain the cockpit door in a position that balanced the co-pilot's ability to communicate with the cabin against the necessity of maintaining the flight environment as a workspace rather than a social one, but ajar, in the specific way of a door that has been left slightly open with intention rather than oversight. Elizabeth stood at the threshold, not entering. The line between the cabin and the cockpit was a physical and regulatory line, and she was aware of both dimensions of it. Joseph was visible in the left seat. His hands on the controls had the quality of hands that had done this 10,000 times, not tense, not relaxed, but present in the way that competence was present, which was a kind of presence that didn't announce itself. The instrument panel spread before him was a landscape of information, and he moved through it the way someone moved through familiar territory, not looking for landmarks because they already knew where they were. The co-pilot was doing something with the navigation display. Joseph became aware of her at the threshold before she said anything. He turned his head a fraction, enough to see her, enough to indicate that the door being open had not been an accident. She said, "How much longer?" 31 minutes. Weather over Puget Sound is clear. We'll have a straight approach. A beat. You should sit down. I've been sitting. Sitting differently then, the kind where the seatbelt is involved. She didn't move. When did you last fly? He looked at the instruments. Not because the instruments needed looking at that particular moment, but because sometimes looking at instruments gave a person something to do with their face while they decided something. 3 years and some months. Karen and I rented a single engine out of a private airfield in Wyoming. Anniversary trip. He said it in the same tone he'd used for everything tonight, factual. Deliberately not decorated. She'd always wanted to see the Snake River Canyon from altitude. We went low and slow, and she took about 40 photographs with a disposable camera she'd bought at a gas station on the way there. A disposable camera. She said digital felt like insurance, like you could always take more. He looked at the horizon, which was beginning to do something in the east. She wanted the 40 to be the 40 that mattered. Elizabeth stood at the threshold with that sentence for a moment. The cockpit windows showed the sky doing its slow business of becoming morning. The line of the horizon gaining definition, the specific gradation from purple to violet to a gray that was beginning to carry the suggestion of color. The Cascades were below and to the south. The water was ahead. And somewhere in the dark geography coming toward them was a building where Ronald Ray was waiting, and a conference table, and a contract with a signature line, and the continuation of everything Gerald Ashford had started with a rented hangar, and a belief that the preparation was never wasted. She said, "Why did you really say what you said?" "Tonight," when I asked. "Joseph, I told you why. You told me it slipped out before you could stop it." "That's accurate. I want to know what was underneath it." She looked at the side of his face. "You don't strike me as a person who says things that slip out and then can't explain what was underneath them." The co-pilot had developed a professional interest in his navigation display. Joseph was quiet for a moment that was not empty. "When Angela died, I went through a period of thinking that the correct response was to make Sandra's life look as normal as possible, as continuous, like a current that didn't break." He looked at the instruments. "What she told me, eventually she was 13, was that she was tired of watching me pretend the current hadn't broken, that the pretending was harder to live with than the break would have been if I'd just acknowledged it." "Elizabeth." She said that at 13. She's always been several years ahead of her stated age. I can't explain that, except to say Angela was the same way, and maybe it transfers. The trace of something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile, and wasn't quite grief, and was probably the expression that existed in the territory between those two things after enough time had passed. After that conversation, I stopped pretending, started telling the truth about what was hard and what was missing, and the thing that came out tonight when you asked. He considered the horizon for a moment. That was one of the things I usually don't say to people outside the house, because it sounds like a request, and I'm not in the business of making requests of strangers at 2 a.m. "Elizabeth, but you said it anyway. You put a price tag on the question. Not accusatory, just observational. You said no limits. And when someone says no limits at 2 a.m. in a situation with no good options, apparently what comes out is the thing without limits. The thing you don't price tag in ordinary life. because ordinary life doesn't accommodate it. Elizabeth looked at the view through the cockpit windows. The horizon was definitely lighter now, specific rather than general. The morning was arriving with the reliability of mornings, indifferent to everything that had occurred beneath it. "I grew up in a house," she said, and she said it in a tone that she didn't typically use in professional settings, which was the tone of someone not performing a version of themselves, where affection was expressed through scheduling. "My father put things he valued in his calendar. If you were in his calendar, you mattered. If you weren't, you were ambient." She paused. "My mother left when I was 9. She didn't leave a calendar entry. Joseph didn't say he was sorry, which was the right response, because sorry wasn't the thing the sentence was asking for. What did she leave? A note, and a very small suitcase, which I think she took as a statement about how little she was taking with her." Elizabeth looked at the horizon. "I've spent most of my adult life trying to be the kind of person who doesn't need anything she doesn't already have. Because needing things is what the note was about, if you read it correctly." The co-pilot was now also very interested in the fuel consumption readout. "Joseph, after a moment, I spent 2 years after Angela died being the same kind of person. Self-contained, sealed. I thought that was integrity. That needing people was a structural weakness you could engineer out if you were disciplined enough." He glanced at her from the left seat. Sandra put a stop to that. She said she didn't want a father who had engineered out the parts that made him worth knowing. Elizabeth absorbed that. Said, "Finally, she sounds like someone worth knowing herself. She's the most impressive person I've ever met, and I've met." He gestured slightly at the cockpit around them, at the implication of the night behind them, a range of people. Elizabeth almost laughed. Not quite, but close enough that the shape of it was present on her face, and both of them knew it was there. She went back to sit down and fasten her seatbelt, because they were 23 minutes from Seattle, and the morning was coming up over the Cascades, and there was a contract waiting, and a company that was still, despite everything, intact. The Seattle-Tacoma area from approach altitude looked like a city that had been designed by someone who couldn't decide between water and land, and had decided the answer was both. Puget Sound spread below in the early morning light flat, gray-green, reflecting a sky that was fully committed to being day now, even if the day hadn't warmed up yet. The aircraft touched down at 7:22 a.m., which was 38 minutes before the deadline. The math of that, the specific and somewhat improbable math of a night that had included a sabotaged aircraft, a board confrontation, a 9-year-old backup terminal, a transfer agreement, a second insider, and a first flight in 3 years and some months, did not escape Elizabeth as she descended the beaten stairs onto the tarmac. The math was, by any reasonable accounting, not the math of a situation that should have resolved in this direction. And yet, the car that met them was a town car, driven by a man who handed Elizabeth a coffee and said good morning, without making any observation about the state of her coat, which was the quality of professionalism that Elizabeth had always compensated well for and intended to continue to. Rebecca got into the car with her laptop already open. Kevin got into the car with his phone already at his ear. Joseph stood at the base of the stairs. Elizabeth looked back at him from the car door. She said, "You're coming in." Not a question. He said, "I'm a mechanic. You're a witness. You're the person who found the data. You're the person who can explain what's on that chip in terms that a room full of aviation investors will understand without a translator." A beat. "And you're coming in." He came in. The offices of Pacific Northwest Aviation Partners occupied the 14th floor of a building in downtown Seattle that had been designed with the particular ambition of Pacific Northwest architecture, glass and steel, that gestured at the mountains visible from the upper floors on clear days, which this day, given the hour and the season and the general quality of Seattle mornings, was not. What the windows showed instead was the gray-green of Puget Sound and the outlines of the Olympic Peninsula in the distance and a sky that was making an effort. Ronald Ray met them in the lobby. He was 61 and his hair was fully silver. And he had the build of someone who had been athletic in a previous decade and maintained just enough of it to suggest that the previous decade wasn't entirely over. He looked at Elizabeth when she came through the door, with the particular look of someone who was gathering information through methods that had nothing to do with her resume. He looked at the sleeve of her coat. He looked at Joseph. He said, You flew here. Elizabeth, we did. From Aspen Ridge, in that aircraft. He meant the Gulf Stream. The aircraft that had been dead on the concrete 5 hours ago. That aircraft flew tonight. Joseph, the mechanical situation was addressable once the actual problem was identified. Ronald Ray looked at Joseph Merritt for a moment in the specific way of someone encountering a category they hadn't prepared a folder for. Then he said, I read the brief Rebecca sent at 6:15 I've been in this industry for 30 years. I've seen sabotage twice. I've never seen it documented within 4 hours of execution by the target's own team. He looked at Elizabeth. That's either extraordinary luck or extraordinary people. Elizabeth. Extraordinary people. One specific one. She didn't look at Joseph when she said it, but the direction of the statement was clear to everyone in the lobby, including Joseph. Ronald, come upstairs. We have coffee that isn't from a vending machine and a room full of people who've been awake since my general counsel called them at 5:30 a.m. They went upstairs. The conference room had 12 people in it. 3 were Seattle partners. 4 were legal and compliance staff. 2 were representatives from the institutional investors, whose capital was contingent on the partnership agreement. 1 was a man Elizabeth recognized as the lead attorney for the agreement itself, a careful-eyed woman named Diane, who had a reputation for reading contracts with the precision of a surgeon, and the suspicion of someone who had seen too many contracts to believe that language was ever accidental. And Scott Holt was on the screen, remote. His system access had been suspended, but he had not been prevented from attempting to join, and he had attempted to join. And Jacob Crane was in the room, in person, sitting at the far end of the table with the quality of someone who had decided that physical presence was a strategic statement and had acted on it. He was 58, and he wore the particular stillness of a man who had learned to conserve an energy for the moments when energy expenditure mattered. He looked at Elizabeth when she walked in. He looked at Joseph. He looked at the sleeve of her coat. He did not look at the sleeve the way Ronald Ray had looked at it. He looked at it the way you look at something that tells you more than the person wearing it intended to share. Elizabeth took the seat at the head of the table. Not a power move, just where the documents were arranged, where the chair was pulled out, where Gerald Ashford's daughter sat down at 7:31 a.m. after the night that had just occurred, and looked at the room with the expression of someone who had run out of performances and was prepared to operate exclusively in the factual. Scott's voice, from the screen, before anyone else spoke, I want to register, for the record, that any data presented in this meeting derived from the improper access of Elizabeth Scott, not loud. Just the end of a direction. Rebecca opened her laptop, rotated it toward the room's display screen, and the data was there: the timestamps, the access logs, the biometric confirmation, the draft transfer agreement with its pre-populated signature blocks, the second version with both signatures waiting. All of it, uploaded to the company's legal archive at 3:47 a.m. with immutable timestamps, presented now in the clean font of a legal document rather than the green and black retro display of a 9-year-old firmware system. The room read it. It took approximately 4 minutes for the room to read it, and in those 4 minutes the quality of the silence in the room changed the way. The quality silence in rooms changes when a group of people is reading something that reorganizes what they thought they knew about the meeting they thought they were attending. One of the institutional investors, a compact, focused woman, who had said nothing since Elizabeth walked in, and whose stillness carried the weight of someone calculating significant numbers, looked at the transfer agreement. Looked at Jacob Crane. Is this document authentic? Jacob Crane. I would need my counsel to review. Is the document authentic? Same inflection. No additional patience in it. Jacob Crane looked at the screen, looked at Elizabeth, looked at his hands, said nothing, which was again its own answer. The investor looked at Elizabeth. You have the originating data. We have the originating data, the access logs, the biometric confirmation, and a statement from a cooperating witness who can speak to the coercion that was used to enable the dispatch manipulation. Elizabeth looked at the room with the directness of someone who had made a decision somewhere over the Cascades to stop managing the story and simply tell it. Last night someone tried to take my company, not through legitimate competition, or a hostile bid or any mechanism that the market would recognize. Through sabotage and fraud, and 9 years of methodical damage to the reputation of the one person who was positioned to expose it, she looked at Joseph, who was standing near the wall rather than seated at the table, because he was not a partner or a board member or an attorney, and he understood the difference between being present and being in the chair. I want to be specific about that. The man who fixed the aircraft tonight is also the man whose career was destroyed the last time Scott Holt needed a problem to disappear. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. Ronald Ray, who had been listening with the quality of someone gathering and not yet spending, Ms. Ashford. I've been in rooms like this for 3 decades. I want to ask you something directly, and I'd like a direct answer. He leaned forward, slightly. Why should we sign with a company that got here by surviving tonight rather than by preventing tonight? And that was the question. The actual question. Cleaned of everything else, Elizabeth. Because preventing everything is not what leadership is. Leadership is what you do when the thing you didn't prevent happens anyway. She held his eye. Last night I had a sabotaged aircraft, a corrupt CO with a pre-executed sale of my company sitting in a buried file, and no maintenance crew. I also had a man who'd been wrongfully removed from this industry for 9 years, who showed up anyway and did the work correctly, because that's how he does work. And I had the sense to trust him when every other voice in the room was telling me not to. A beat. Any company can be compromised from the inside. Show me a company that can document the compromise in 4 hours, remove the responsible party before the business day starts, and still make the meeting on time, and I will show you the company worth signing with. The room was quiet. Ronald Ray looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Joseph. You, not unkind, just direct. You found all of it. Joseph, I found what was findable. The backup terminal had the data. The data was there because the aircraft was old enough to have an independent firmware layer. I recognized the failure pattern because I'd seen the same technique before, from the same person. And the prior incident, Meridian Air Group, Texas, 9 years ago. I filed a report that was altered before it reached the regulator. The original was preserved in my own records. He looked at Ronald Ray without looking away. Rebecca has requested a formal reopening of that investigation through the FAA's Inspector General Office. The documentation from tonight provides corroborating evidence for the original falsification. It's the same method, different numbers, same hand. Diane, the contract attorney, who had been taking notes in a manner that suggested she was going to need several more pages. Mr. Merritt, can you confirm your current certifications? Joseph listed them. Current commercial license. Current test flight certification. Aircraft type ratings, including the specific model they'd just landed. Continued education credits through the previous calendar year. Diane wrote things down. Jacob Crane stood up. The room looked at him. He was going to say something. His face had the arrangement of a man composing the sentence that gets him out of a room with the most intact version of his reputation that the circumstances will support. And then he looked at the data on the screen, all of it, still up, immutable, time-stamped, and he made a different calculation. He said, I'll be speaking with my counsel. Walked to the door, opened it, stopped, and said to no one in particular, in the voice of a man who had been in rooms for 30 years, and knew when a room had made its decision, well played. He left. Scott, from the screen, said. She reached forward and closed the laptop. The screen went dark. Diane looked up from her notes, looked at the room, looked at Elizabeth. The document is ready for signature. I've reviewed the terms. Nothing has changed from the agreed language. A pause. If you're ready. Elizabeth looked at the pen Diane set on the table. She signed. The signature was the same one that had been on documents since she was 22 years old. And Gerald Ashford had handed her her first contract and told her to sign her name the same way every time. Because your signature was a promise, and promises didn't have casual versions. She signed it the same way every time. Outside, Seattle was becoming its own particular morning. The cloud cover that the city maintained as a matter of local custom was holding at medium altitude, which meant the light was diffuse and even and cast no shadows, which was either depressing or peaceful, depending on your relationship with direct sunlight. Elizabeth was standing on the sidewalk outside the building, with a coffee that was not from a vending machine, Snaffine Crackschen, and was therefore approximately 1,000% better than the coffee she'd had on the aircraft, which was approximately 1,000% better than the coffee she'd had from Dale's ancient machine in the hangar at 4:53 a.m., which meant she'd had 3 coffees in approximately 4 hours and could feel all of them. Joseph came out after her. He'd stayed upstairs for the post-signing conversations. 20 minutes of the careful professional exchange that happens when large sums of money have just changed their intended trajectory, and everyone in the room wants to document that they behaved correctly throughout. He'd answered 3 questions from the compliance team, provided his contact information to Diane, and declined the offer of breakfast with the polite specificity of a man who had a daughter who had a presentation at school this morning and needed to be home. He stood next to Elizabeth on the Seattle sidewalk at 8:14 a.m., and they both looked at Puget Sound, which was visible at the end of the street in the distance, flat and gray-green and doing nothing in particular, which was one of the things about large bodies of water. They had no investment in what was happening on the land around them. And that indifference was, in certain moments, genuinely restful. Elizabeth, you're flying back. I'm flying back. Sandra's presentation is at 10:30. That's tight. That's fine. He looked at the water. I've been tight before. She looked at him from the sidewalk, in the diffuse Seattle morning light, without the amber hangar lighting, and the crisis, and the specific intensity of a situation where everything was at stake. He looked not different, the same. Which was the thing about some people. They were the same in every light. The investigation, she said, into Meridian. Into what happened 9 years ago. Rebecca mentioned she was starting the process. I'll make sure it happens. Not a promise made for the sake of making it. A promise made in the way of a person who understood the specific weight of 9 years and what it cost, and what would be required to address it correctly. The certification that was suspended. The record. All of it. Joseph, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. She met his eye. You asked for one thing tonight, not money. Not a position, not anything that had a price tag on it. You asked for your record to be examined honestly. She held his look. I'm going to make sure that happens. Something moved in his face. Not relief or not only relief. The thing underneath relief. The thing that had been living under 9 years of freelance contracts and one-eyed trucks and kitchen table solitude, and the quiet maintenance of certifications that no one was asking for. He said, thank you. 2 words. Minimal, exact. She said, don't thank me yet. Bureaucratic processes move at their own pace, and their own pace is frequently infuriating. He almost laughed. The shape of it was there, not the laugh itself yet, but the shape. The flight back was different from the flight out in the way that all return trips were different from departures, the same geography in reverse, but the light was changed, and the weight of the destination was different. And the person sitting in the cabin was not the same person who had left Colorado at 5:23 a.m., even though she used the same name and wore the same coat. Elizabeth sat in the 3rd seat on the left. The seat her father had sat in 4 times, eating gas station almonds and reading specifications for aircraft he would never afford. She thought about that, the specificity of his hope, the way he had invested in possibilities without requiring them to materialize on any particular schedule. Gerald Ashford had believed in the long view in a way that his daughter had always understood intellectually, and had, somewhere in the operational demands of the last 11 years, stopped actually practicing. She looked at the seat like it was evidence of something. Rebecca worked. Kevin slept, finally, in the front seat, with his jacket folded under his head, and the specific vulnerability of a 28-year-old who had been awake for 22 hours, and had spent most of them in the proximity of decisions that would have consequences for years. The cockpit door was open the same amount it had been on the way out. Elizabeth did not go to the threshold this time. She looked at the back of Joseph's head through the gap, and she thought about what Sandra had told him when she was 13, that the pretending was harder to live with than the break itself, that the sealed version of a person was the version that got smaller over time. Not because life demanded less, but because it stopped being asked for more. She had spent 35 years being very good at the sealed version. She thought about that for most of the flight back, not in a way that produced a conclusion she was ready to name. in the way of someone who has found the right question and understands that the right question precedes the answer by a variable and occasionally substantial amount of time. The aircraft descended into Colorado. The Rockies came back below them, snow on the peaks, and the long valleys between them and the rivers that moved through those valleys. Without asking anyone's permission and without consulting a schedule, they landed at Aspen Ridge at 10:08 a.m. The hangar looked different in daylight, not dramatically different. The same dimensions, the same yellow lights that were now largely unnecessary in the morning sun coming through the open hangar doors. The same oil stains on the concrete in the configurations they'd always been in. But a space that had held a crisis at 2 a.m. felt different when the crisis was resolved, and the morning had arrived and the space had resumed being simply what it was. Dale was there. He had the expression of a man who had been awake for the entire intervening period, and was processing his feelings about that in real time. He looked at the aircraft coming in from Seattle, and then at Elizabeth coming down the boarding stairs, and then at Joseph right behind her, and he made a small sound that was probably relief, and might have been something more complicated. Joseph had a car to drive back to Glenwood Springs. Sandra's presentation was at 10:30, which meant he was going to make it if traffic was cooperative, and it would be because traffic on that route at that hour on a weekday was not usually a problem. Elizabeth stood at the base of the boarding stairs, while Rebecca and Kevin handled the post-flight logistics with the ground crew. Joseph was at his truck. He'd put his toolbox in the bed. He stopped before getting in. She walked across the hangar floor, and here was what she could have said. She could have said thank you in the formal version, the CEO version. The version that maintained the appropriate professional distance and acknowledged a significant service without crossing into any territory that required follow-up. She had that version ready. She'd been using it for 11 years. It was clean and functional, and it never required anything complicated afterward. She said, instead, what you said at 2 a.m. When I asked, Joseph, I remember what I said. It wasn't I want to be clear that I understood what it was. It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't a request that I'm supposed to honor because of extenuating circumstances in a hangar. She looked at him directly. I know what it was. It was the truth coming out before you had a chance to decide whether to say it. Joseph, that's what it was. I want to tell you something in the same category. She held his eye. I don't know how to want things that don't have a defined return. That's not. I'm not saying that for sympathy. I'm saying it because it's accurate and you've been operating on accurate all night and it seems appropriate to return the gesture. She paused, but I am beginning to understand that the things worth wanting don't come with defined returns. That's apparently how you know they're the right ones. Joseph looked at her for a moment, long enough to be looking and not just seeing. That's not a small thing to understand. No. She glanced down at the oil stain on her coat sleeve. Still there, probably permanent. It cost about $4,000 in dry cleaning fees to get there, but no, and he laughed. Not the almost law from the Seattle sidewalk, the actual laugh. Short and genuine and arrived at without warning, in the way that the real ones arrived without preparation, without the awareness that it was coming, just there suddenly and then over, leaving the face that had produced it slightly different than before. It was the kind of laugh that changed the shape of a face. Elizabeth recognized it because Sandra Merritt, who was 15 years old and several years ahead of her stated age, had described it to her in a hotel lobby in Denver several weeks later, at the launch of the Angela Merritt Foundation Scholarship Fund. Private aviation, children of industry workers, named without fanfare or public announcement, just named, because some things deserved a name in the following terms, not the polite one, the one where his eyes go with it. That was the one. The investigation into Scott Holt was opened formally within 48 hours, the federal component which was, in the end, exactly what Rebecca had said it would be, which was the kind of case that made prosecutors interested. Moved more quickly than most people expected these things to move, for the specific reason that the documentation was exceptionally organized. Because Rebecca Ashby had been organizing it since approximately 3:47 a.m. in a Colorado hangar while other things were happening. Ronald Garrett cooperated fully. His statement covered 8 months of coercion, and a loan that had been called in with terms that weren't legal. and a phone call from a hospital bed at 6:47 p.m. that he'd made because he was going into surgery in an hour, and had believed mistakenly that doing what Scott asked one more time would be the last time. Scott maintained his position for approximately 6 weeks, which was how long it took for the Meridian Air Group investigation to be formally reopened by the FAA's Inspector General, at which point several documents surfaced from the Meridian archive that Scott's own signature was on in ways his attorneys had difficulty explaining. He made an agreement with the federal prosecutors in Week 9. Jacob Crane's firm was examined by securities regulators as a function of the transfer agreement. The examination found the Ashford situation was not the first time a pre-positioned acquisition agreement had appeared in connection with an apparent operational failure at a target company. The examination widened. It was still widening at the time this story ends, which meant it would be widening for considerably longer after. The FAA review of the original Meridian case took 6 weeks, which was considerably faster than cases like this typically moved, and which Rebecca attributed, privately, to the fact that the documentation she submitted was organized with the same precision she brought to everything, and that precision was, in a regulatory environment drowning in disorganized submissions, genuinely refreshing. Joseph Merritt's certification was formally restored, not suspended, not returned with conditions, restored fully, cleanly, with a finding that the original suspension had been based on documentation that was subsequently determined to be fraudulent. The finding went into his professional record. The previous finding was removed from it. He read the official notice in his kitchen on a Tuesday evening, after Sandra had gone upstairs to do homework. He read it twice, folded it, put it in the drawer where he kept important documents, next to Sandra's birth certificate and their lease, and a photograph of Angela that he'd kept a duplicate of since shortly after she died, because he'd been worried about what might happen to the one on the refrigerator. He sat in the kitchen for a while. The light was the same kitchen light it always was, warm and overhead and slightly too bright if you were in a particular mood, but not tonight. Not tonight it wasn't too bright. He thought about the 9 years, not with bitterness. Bitterness was a destination you arrived at, only if you kept taking the road toward it, and he'd made different turns, but with the specific reckoning of a person who understands what the years contained. The freelance contracts, the overnight shifts, the maintained certifications that no one was asking to see, the kitchen table at midnight, the photograph on the refrigerator, Sandra at 13, telling him the truth at exactly the moment he needed to hear it. None of it came back. That was the thing about years. They didn't come back. What happened was that the record was corrected, and the correction was real, and the world moved forward from a different starting point than it had been at for a while. That was enough. Actually enough, not performatively enough. The kind of enough that didn't require anything added. He put the notice in the drawer, made tea, went to find Sandra, who was upstairs doing homework, which she was not actually doing but was instead reading a novel, that she was intending to say was research for English class, if questioned about it, which Joseph knew because he recognized the cover through her doorway and knew it had nothing to do with her current English curriculum, and which he did not comment on, because some things were better left as the private dignities of 15-year-olds with a lot on their minds. He said goodnight. She said goodnight. He went back downstairs. The last time this story needs to be in a hangar is a month after Seattle. The hangar was itself again. The crisis smell was gone, whatever combination of adrenaline and anxiety, and 3 a.m. urgency had saturated the air that night had dissipated into the ordinary operational atmosphere of a working airfield. The Gulf Stream was in its place, clean, maintained by the correct crew under the correct protocols, its systems running exactly as they were supposed to run. Elizabeth arrived without notice. Not dramatically without notice. She'd sent a text to the airfield manager, but without the advance preparation that usually preceded her appearances at company facilities. No advance team, no Kevin, no specific agenda beyond the one she'd had since approximately somewhere over the Cascades on a November morning when the right question had started to take shape. Joseph was running a routine inspection, not because he was required to. He'd accepted the position of Director of Flight Integrity at Ashford Aerotech 6 weeks earlier, which came with an office and an administrative assistant, and a title that Rebecca had drafted the contract for with visible satisfaction. He was running the inspection, because the routine inspection was something that needed doing, and he was there, and he was the kind of person who did things that needed doing without waiting to be asked twice. Elizabeth stood at the hangar entrance for a moment and watched him, not sentimentally, not in the way of a scene designed to produce a particular feeling, in the way of someone who had spent 35 years in rooms where the work being done was abstract numbers and agreements and projections and the management of capital, and was watching someone do work that was concrete and specific and completely indifferent to how it was perceived. She walked across the hangar floor. He heard her and turned. He was wearing a jacket that was a different jacket from the one he'd worn that night, newer, but the same practical category. The kind of jacket that would look like this in 18 months. Elizabeth, Sandra's presentation. How did it go? Joseph. She got an A. She cited 3 primary sources and one that she called a primary source, but was actually a secondary source that she'd paraphrased well enough that her teacher didn't notice. Elizabeth, strategic. She gets that from somewhere. He looked at Elizabeth with the look he had, which was the look of someone who had been paying attention to the world long enough to read it without performing the act of reading. You could have emailed about the inspection report. Elizabeth, I could have. You didn't. I didn't. The hangar light in the afternoon was different from the hangar light at 2 in the morning, which was different from the hangar light at 10 in the morning when they'd come back from Seattle. This version was warmer. The sun was low enough that it came through the open doors at an angle that made long gold strips across the concrete floor, not the artificial yellow of the overhead lighting but actual light, which had a different quality, which had the quality of things that arrived without being arranged. She said, I have a reservation. Joseph, for what? Dinner. In Glenwood Springs. A place Kevin found that he says is good, which means it has reviews and is within an hour's drive and is not a chain, which is the entirety of my current criteria for restaurants. A beat. I thought Sandra might want to come. Something in Joseph's face did the careful accounting that faces did when they were taking an incoming thing seriously and determining how to hold it. That's not a small gesture. No. She looked at the aircraft, the same aircraft, clean and whole and sitting in the afternoon light. But I've been taking the unsmall gestures more seriously lately. I'm told that's a development. Joseph considered that. Who told you that? Someone at 2 in the morning who said that some things were better left to unfold in their own time rather than being forced into a single dramatic sentence. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I said that. You did. He looked at the aircraft too for a moment, and then at her. Sandra's going to ask you about the company. She's been doing research. She has opinions about vertical integration in regional aviation markets. Elizabeth, I like her already. She's also going to tell you, at some point during the meal, that your coat has a stain on the left sleeve that was probably hydraulic fluid, and that it didn't come out in the dry cleaning. Elizabeth looked down at her sleeve. The sleeve of a different coat, clean and complete. She'd gotten rid of the other one. She said, tell her I know. Tell her I kept it longer than I probably should have, because it reminded me of the night I learned that the most important decisions I'll ever make are the ones I make at the point where the data runs out, and what's left is whether I trust the person standing in front of me. Joseph was very still for a moment. Then that's a long thing to tell a 15-year-old over dinner. Elizabeth, she's several years ahead of her stated age. I think she can handle it. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the afternoon light made its long strips across the hangar floor between them, without asking whether it was welcome, without consulting whether the timing was right, arriving the way light arrived and leaving the way light left according to its own schedule, indifferent to everyone else's, and precisely on time. Joseph, dinner's at what time? Elizabeth, 7. We'll be there. And that was the agreement. 2 words. Minimal. Exact, the same economy he applied to everything, no more than the situation required, no less than it deserved. Elizabeth walked out of the hangar into the Colorado afternoon. Behind her, Joseph went back to the inspection. Because the inspection needed doing. Because that was the kind of person he was. And because some things in this world were worth doing correctly, especially when the only person watching was yourself. The afternoon continued. The mountains were visible to the west, the same mountains that had been there, through every version of this story, through the darkness at 1:47 and the cold and the crisis and the long flight, and the Seattle morning and the drive home and the drawer with the important documents and the kitchen light and the good night at the door. Through all of it, the mountains had been where they were. They were still there. Some things didn't move, and some things did.